I've been invited to talk to you a little bit about women, leadership, diversity tonight. And I always think it's important to start this discussion by putting this in a broader historical context. The 50 years that we've just lived through have seen the single largest movement of women out of the private domestic sphere and into the realm of the public realm of work, leadership and decision making ever in human history. And it has happened at an exponential rate. For those of us who are living in it, it doesn't feel very fast. Feels far too slow for our liking. But this is a social phenomenon that is in all developed countries around the world changing everything. It's changing economies. It is growing GDP. In Australia, something like 23% of our current GDP is credited to the movement of women into the workforce here in this country in the mid-1970s and beyond. And it's also changing the relationships between men and women as each of us every day navigates this massive historical shift when we have to work through who's going to do the childcare pickup, when we have to cope with one of us earning more than the other, perhaps in a relationship that we hadn't expected where the woman is earning more than her male partner. Let's be frank, no company grows, no company or organisation thrives without taking a few risks. If you stay in the safe lane, people are going to go whizzing past you. So you've actually got to take a few risks. And often the people in the organisation who can do that are admired and progress through the organisation. For women, often when they take a risk and it fails, it actually confirms a stereotype about them not being up to the position. And whether that happens or not, many women fear that it will happen. So I think there is something about something important in organisational culture that values failure for the right reasons. That when you encourage one of your people to take a risk, you've actually got to back them when the risk doesn't pay off, and they've got to know that you're going to back them, and whether they're men or women. It's not only men who have stereotypes about women, we have stereotypes about ourselves. And we see ourselves in particular ways, the way that society sees us, we internalise that, and we also have stereotypes about men. And those things are deeply ingrained within us. I then had one of my branch members who, not a best friend, but a woman who I'd known for a very long time, who'd supported me actively, took me aside, slightly older than me at the time, and said, "Anna, people are starting to say things about you, and I think I should tell you." And she said it in that way when you knew they weren't saying good things about you. And I thought, well, better hear this. And she sort of minced around a bit, and then she sort of almost whispered as if it was such a terrible thing. She said, "Well, they're saying that you're ambitious." And I mean, when you really think about it, do any of us want our members of parliament to be unambitious? No secret to you, I vote for one side of politics. But when the rest of the electorate votes for another side and, we have a Prime Minister that's not from my side, I want him or her to be ambitious for my country. I want the people who occupy those offices to be full of ambition for their state, their country, and to get into those offices, they have to also have a level of personal ambition. It is actually a very important, powerful, motivating, driving force. But for many women, it is still seen as a criticism. It's still something which many women don't like to have said about them. And for me personally, I really had to think at that point, and it's quite a long time ago now, okay, am I going to change my behaviour because people are saying this about me? Or am I going to accept that if I continue to behave the way I have been, that there will be consequences and I'm prepared to live with them? And I chose the latter, obviously. But for me, I think about that moment as owning my ambition. And I think it's something that many women don't stop and think about and do. Up until that point, I hadn't stopped and thought about myself in that way. And it was important to do that because that's how other people were seeing me. And particularly in the political world, but it's the same in the corporate world, it's the same maybe in a different way in the corporate world. How everyone else sees you matters to the way you move up or down. So you have to decide whether you can live with and get over some of those things. How do we create a world in which it is just as okay for a young man to take a year off as it is for a young woman when they have very small children? And I really do think that the big challenge for us is how to ensure that those sorts of new work practices are not just another way of marginalising women. Well motivated, designed to achieve diversity, but in fact might have entirely the opposite effect. The moment that most of you will be most familiar with in my experience of leadership was during those terrible floods and disasters. Not only was I doing that as a woman, but it was a totally unprecedented, it was an event without precedent. But I was trying to imagine a form of leadership there that there was no reference point. I was trying to draw on, what other leadership I had seen at moments of crises. And I just couldn't find a woman's voice in any, known recent history that I could think I want to do it like that, or that was a good way of doing it, or, lean on those sorts of ideas or draw on this. And so it is something that I was very conscious while I was doing it, that I was literally inventing. And as I said earlier, when you're making history, that's what all of us are doing. Sometimes you're very conscious of it, as I was at that moment, but whether you're conscious of it or not, every single person in this room is literally once or twice a week doing something that would have been really difficult for their mums, impossible for their grandmothers, and for many of the men in the room, things that their fathers have no point of reference to talk with you about in terms of your role in families.
Something to think about if you wonder if this really is a business program or not. The green bars on the left are large corporations that have 0 women on their board of directors. The bars on the right are large corporations that have 3 or more women on the board of directors. And you see a 60% improvement in return on investment for those firms that have 3 or more women on their boards. Right? I'm not very good at math, I'm not a statistician, I can't prove to you that there's a causal relationship there, but as business managers, we get paid to make decisions with imperfect information. That's what we have to do, right? We never know the facts. We don't really know what's going on out there. You take your best shot based on what you know. Based on that information, I would bet on that information, right? There's enough there for me as a business manager to say that's something we ought to be doing. Keep moving forward in the organization and realize we need those bars you saw at the right-hand side of the chart to keep growing.